In the last section, we used the model instance function remove to remove Joe from our database or collection of users. We then saw a little bit of fancy footwork with our promises in here. The reason that we had to use a little bit of fancy promises was we had to make sure that the operation to remove Joe occurred. Then we had to go back through the collection again and attempt to find any user with the name of Joe. And so we essentially had two promises in a row that had to be executed sequentially. So that's really the key. We had to make sure that they were executed sequentially. To do so, we used a little bit of fancy syntax here. Most notably, from the first promise, we returned another operation that returns a promise. The second .then here operated on the promise that was returned from the find one operation. So with words, that's kind of hard to really understand. Let's try to look at a diagram and figure out what's going on. So we called Joe.remove. When we did that, it returned a promise. Inside that first promise, we said, when Joe is gone, try to find a user with the name of Joe. And then once that operation completed, the second .then right here tapped into the promise that was returned by this operation. So we then asserted that the query did not find a user. If we think about this in a slightly different fashion, you could think of Joe.remove as returning promise number one. So Joe.remove returned a promise number one that we then chained onto. Then because that then returned a promise of its own, we now got promise number two, which is what the second .then chained itself onto. So when this second .then was resolved, it was called with whatever the result of user.findOne was, which was supposedly a user, but since we know that there's not supposed to be a user there, we made an assertion to say that it was null. And then we called our callback of done to say, hey, Mocha, we're all done with our stuff. So yes, definitely a little bit of confusing little bit of work with promises here, but definitely a common pattern that we'll use frequently whenever we want to chain promises together. Note that we could have taken this entire .then statement right here and chained it directly onto user.findOne. Maybe we should do that really quick just to make sure it's really clear the alternative syntax we could have used. So I'm going to make a little bit of a quick change here. So if I do like so, this would have been equivalent code. So this reads a little bit easier on the logic side, but definitely the syntax is a little bit nastier. So this would have been remove Joe, then do our user.findOne and specifically chain onto that user.findOne with a .then. So it would have been equivalent, but a little bit nastier to look at. So I'm going to do a little bit of undo and go back to the code that I had before. Okay, so here we are back to where I was. So again, this is our first way of removing a record out of a collection. Let's move on to our next method, which is to use the class method remove. The difference between the instance remove and class method remove is that instead of referring to an instance of a user, like when we are looking at Joe, we are looking at the class of user overall. We specifically use class method remove whenever we want to remove a bunch of records at the same time. So remove a bunch of records with some given criteria. So in practice, we might call remove, and then we'll say, I want to remove every user with a name of Joe, like so. And that's pretty much it as far as the actual remove command goes. So now we can take all the same follow-up code to make our actual assertion. So I'm just going to copy paste it all down. So I'm going to take everything from the .then going down, and I'll paste it in like so. And I'll save. Let's check out our specs. And looks like I forgot to grab my .then callback. So I'm going to make sure that my class method remove right here, I'm going to add on the .then like so. So I'll add on the .then, and okay, now my test is passing again. So again, using the class method remove is a lot more useful whenever we want to remove a bunch of different records that have some common criteria. This is in direct juxtaposition with the model instance remove, where we're saying remove on this one very specific method or this one very specific record right here. So in this case, it wouldn't have mattered if I passed in some criteria, because this is not a reference to the entire collection of users. It's a reference to specifically just Joe. Okay, so another little method of removing a user. Let's continue with the last two ways of removing users in the next section.